Hello and welcome back to Sleep RPG. Relax and take a deep breath as you let your eyelids grow heavy and your mind go blank. Allow yourself to forget about your worries as you doze off to the complete lore of Queen Marika the Eternal. Deep within the roots of the Erd Tree, suspended in golden light, hangs the shattered form of a goddess. Queen Marika the Eternal, vessel of the Elden Ring, divine sovereign of the lands between. Her story is one of tragedy and triumph, of betrayal and ambition, of a simple shaman who would rise to godhood and reshape the very fabric of reality itself. To understand the Shattering, to understand the broken world we traverse as tarnished, we must first understand her. We must trace the threads of her existence back to their beginning, to a humble village hidden in shadow, where everything began. But before we can truly understand Marika, we must understand the world she entered. The lands between existed long before her ascension, shaped by forces and powers that stretched back into an almost incomprehensible past. There was an age of dragons, when ancient creatures of stone and lightning ruled the skies. Placidusax, the Dragon Lord, served as Elden Lord to a god whose identity has been lost to time. This was before the Erd Tree dominated the landscape, before the Golden Order defined reality itself. It was an age of different laws, different powers, different ways of being. Before even the dragons, there was the Crucible, described as the primordial form of the Erd Tree. The Crucible represented a time when all life was blended together, when the boundaries between different forms of existence were not yet fixed. From this churning mass of primordial life came all manner of beings, creatures with aspects we would later call bestial or monstrous, but which in that ancient time were simply natural expressions of life's infinite variety. Wings, horns, tails, scales, all manner of physical traits emerged from the Crucible's chaotic creativity. The astrologers came next, scholars who studied the night sky and claimed to read fate in the movements of stars. They built great cities underground, the eternal cities of Nokron and Nokstella, civilizations that flourished in caverns lit by their own artificial stars. These people developed remarkable sorceries and technologies, created silver tears that could mimic any form, and apparently drew the ire of the greater will itself. Their cities were destroyed, buried beneath the earth, in what some interpret as divine punishment for their ambitions. Into this world of ancient powers and fallen civilizations, the Numen came. They were described as descendants of denizens from another world, long-lived but seldom born. Where exactly they came from remains one of the great mysteries. Some believe they originated in the ruined eternal cities, that they were survivors of that catastrophe who climbed up from the depths to settle in the lands above. Others suggest they came from somewhere even more distant, from beyond the lands between entirely, refugees from a place we cannot even imagine. What we know with certainty is that the Numen possessed remarkable qualities. Their flesh had unique properties, an ability to harmonize and meld with other living things that set them apart from all other peoples. They were spiritual by nature, many of them becoming what were called shamans, holy women who served as intermediaries between the physical and divine realms. And among these Numen shamans, in a small village hidden away in what would become the realm of shadow, a girl was born who would change everything. Her name was Marika. This is the complete history of Queen Marika the Eternal. Before she was a goddess, before she was a queen, before the Golden Order and the age of the Erd Tree, Marika was simply a girl, a Numen, a member of a race described as descendants of denizens from another world, long-lived but seldom born. The Numen are mysterious in origin, their homeland spoken of only in whispers and fragments. Some believe they once dwelled in the eternal cities, those ancient metropolises now buried deep beneath the earth, punished by the greater will for sins we can only speculate about. Others suggest they came from somewhere beyond the lands between entirely, from a realm we cannot fathom. What we know for certain is that a tribe of these Numen, calling themselves shamans, settled in a place that would come to be known simply as the Shaman Village. This settlement lay in what is now called the Realm of Shadow, in a region called the Hinterlands, nestled near the towering finger ruins of Dio. It was a place of profound beauty. Fields of many-coloured flowers stretched in every direction, painting the landscape in hues of purple, gold, and crimson. Small, humble homes dotted the hillsides, simple structures that spoke of a people content with modest living. At the heart of this village stood something remarkable: the grandmother. The grandmother was not simply a leader or matriarch in the conventional sense. She was something more, something that speaks to the unique nature of the shamans themselves. Her body had grafted itself into a tree, or perhaps the tree had grown from her, the distinction between flesh and bark long since blurred. She stood there with arms outstretched in eternal prayer, her form petrified and preserved, a living monument to the shaman's spiritual connection to nature itself. The tree that had become part of her, or that she had become part of, was not dead wood, but something still alive in its own way, a symbiotic union that suggested the shamans understood life and consciousness in fundamentally different ways than other peoples did. This was not simply metaphor or symbolism. The shamans possessed something extraordinary within their very biology, an innate property that set them apart from all other beings in the lands between. We see evidence of this ability passed down through Marika's bloodline to her descendants. Godric the Grafted, a distant heir of Marika's line through Godwyn, possessed an unnatural facility for attaching the limbs and body parts of others to himself. While his grafting was crude and grotesque, forced through violence and surgery, it worked in ways it should not have. Ordinary people cannot simply have foreign limbs attached and expect them to function. But Godric's grafted arms moved, his transplanted legs carried his weight, because he inherited from Marika's Numen blood that special property of flesh that could harmonize with foreign tissue. Similarly, when Godwyn died and his corpse was buried in the Erd tree's roots, his body did not simply decay. Instead, it spread. His dead flesh merged with the roots, grew through them, transformed them. The death root that sprouted from places his corruption touched was not mere rot, but a fusion of Godwyn's essence with the Erd tree itself, his Numen flesh even in death seeking to meld with the living wood around it. And Miquella, another of Marika's children, could embed himself within his Halig tree, merging his body with the tree he had grown from his own blood, sleeping within its trunk as the grandmother had done, their flesh and the tree's wood becoming one substance. These were all echoes of the shaman's gift, this remarkable ability to blur the boundaries between self and other, between one living thing and another. In the shamans, this gift was spiritual as much as physical. They used it to commune with nature, to become one with the trees and flowers and earth of their valley. The grandmother's fusion with her tree was not an aberration, but the fullest expression of their spiritual practice. A holy woman, becoming one with the sacred grove she tended. Their flesh, you see, had the remarkable ability to meld harmoniously with that of others. This was not some magical gift bestowed upon them, but rather a fundamental characteristic of their Numen physiology. Where other beings maintained rigid boundaries between self and other, the shamans could blur these lines. They could merge, blend, adapt. The grandmother's fusion with the tree was the ultimate expression of this gift, a demonstration of the shaman's profound affinity for unity with the natural world around them. It was beautiful in its way, a peaceful existence in communion with the earth, with the trees, with each other. The shamans were, by all accounts, a gentle people. Their village shows no signs of fortifications, no weapons of war, no preparations for conflict. They lived quietly, tending their flower fields, practicing their spiritual traditions, existing in harmony with the world. They were, perhaps, too gentle, too trusting. Because their unique gift, this ability for their flesh to meld with others, would become their curse. It would draw the attention of those who saw not beauty in this quality, but utility, potential, power. In Japanese, the shamans are referred to as Miko, a term used for Shinto priestesses. This suggests they were not merely villagers, but spiritual practitioners, holy women who served as intermediaries between the physical and divine realms. They were blind maidens, according to some accounts, their physical sight perhaps sacrificed or surrendered in exchange for deeper spiritual vision. They communed with trees, with the grandmother, with forces beyond mortal comprehension. They were innocent, in the truest sense of that word, untouched by the corruption and violence that plagued so much of the world beyond their flower-filled valley. Marika grew up in this place. She played in those flower fields as a child, learned the ways of her people, studied under the grandmother's eternal vigil. What was she like before everything that came after? We can only imagine. A girl with golden hair, perhaps already showing signs of the extraordinary destiny that awaited her. Or perhaps she was utterly ordinary by the standards of her people, indistinguishable from any other young shaman learning the traditions of her tribe. The shamans would gather, performing rituals we can only guess at, their practices lost to time and tragedy. Because tragedy was coming, the shamans' isolation would not last forever. Beyond their peaceful valley, in the lands controlled by the Hornsent, word had spread of these peculiar people and their even more peculiar gift. The Hornsent, who worshipped the crucible, the primordial form of the Erd tree, where all life was once blended together, became fascinated by the shaman's natural ability to meld flesh. To the Hornsent, this was not just interesting, but profoundly significant. Here was a people who embodied, in their very biology, the sacred unity that the Hornsent revered. But the Hornsent did not seek to learn from the shamans or to honor them. Instead, they saw opportunity. They saw a resource to be exploited. The Hornsent had developed a ritual, a practice they called the Jar Ritual. It was meant to be a form of rebirth, a way to remake those deemed unworthy into something better, something closer to the divine unity of the crucible. The ritual was brutal in its simplicity. They would take criminals, heretics, and those they considered lesser beings, and they would cut them apart, slice them into pieces. Then they would stuff these dismembered bodies into large jars, cramming the flesh of many individuals together in one confined space. The theory, such as it was, held that if you forced different bodies to occupy the same vessel, they would merge, blend, become something new, something pure, a saint. But it wasn't working. Not well enough, at least. The flesh of ordinary people did not meld properly. The jars produced only horror, twitching masses of meat and bone that never quite became the transcendent beings the Hornsent sought to create. The spirits of the butchered dead clung to these malformed creations, rancorous and suffering. They needed something more, someone whose flesh was naturally suited to this grotesque blending. They needed the shamans. The Hornsent came to the Shaman Village not as guests or traders, but as predators. They descended upon that peaceful place with violence and purpose, and what followed was nothing short of systematic genocide. The shamans, with their gentle ways and complete lack of martial tradition, could offer no meaningful resistance. They were captured, bound, dragged from their homes, while the flower fields watched in silent witness. The Hornsent showed no mercy because they did not see the shamans as people deserving of mercy. To the Hornsent, the shamans were raw material, components to be used in their sacred rituals. To understand why the Hornsent did this, we must understand their worldview. The Hornsent were worshippers of the crucible, that primordial form where all life had once been blended together. They saw this ancient unity as sacred, as the divine state from which all existence had fallen. Those born with horns, which they believed were marks of connection to the crucible, were revered in their society. The horn was not a curse, but a blessing, proof that the crucible's power still flowed through certain bloodlines. Their entire civilization was built around venerating the crucible and seeking to recapture its unified state. The jar ritual was their attempt to recreate the crucible's blending on a small scale. By taking multiple individuals and forcing their flesh to occupy the same vessel, they believed they could remake people, purify them, transform criminals and undesirables into saints. The jars they used were massive pottery vessels, large enough to hold the dismembered remains of multiple people. The ritual keepers would perform their ceremonies, invoking the crucible's power, trying to create the conditions for true fusion. But human flesh, ordinary flesh from ordinary people, did not meld properly. The results were grotesque failures, twitching masses that were neither living nor dead, animated by the rage and suffering of the butchered victims whose remains had been crammed together. Then they heard about the shamans. Word reached the Hornsent towers of a people whose flesh could naturally harmonize with that of others, who possessed as an innate quality what the Hornsent had been desperately trying to create through ritual and violence. To the Hornsent, this was not just useful, but religiously significant. Here was proof that the crucible's power could exist in flesh, that unity was possible. But they did not see the shamans as holy beings to be revered. They saw them as ingredients to be harvested. They were taken to a place called Bonny Village, a settlement that would become synonymous with unspeakable cruelty. There, the shamans were subjected to the jar ritual. But for them, the horror was even more profound because the ritual actually worked as intended. Their flesh, blessed or cursed with its natural ability to harmonize with others, did exactly what the Hornsent hoped it would. When the shamans were butchered and stuffed into jars with the remains of criminals and heretics, their flesh melded. It merged. It created something new. The result was what we now encounter scattered across the lands between, the living jars. These ambulatory pots, filled with the blended remains of countless victims, shamble through the world carrying within them the horror of their creation. Inside each jar writhes what is described as jar innards, flesh that is pinkish red and twitching, animated by rancorous spirits that cling to these amalgamated remains. The shamans had become the very binding agent that made this atrocity possible. Without their flesh, the jar ritual produced only failure. With it, the Hornsent could manufacture their so-called saints en masse. A phantom found in Bonny Village speaks words that echo across the centuries, words that reveal the casual cruelty with which the Hornsent viewed their victims. The spirit says, "For pity's sake, your place is in the jar. Nigh sainthood itself awaits you within. For shamans like you, this is your lot. Life were you accorded for this alone." Can you imagine being told that your very existence, the only reason you were born, was to be torn apart and crammed into a jar? That your people's sacred gift, your connection to the unity of life itself, made you nothing more than fuel for someone else's religious obsessions? The Shaman Village was emptied. One by one, its inhabitants were spirited away to their doom. The homes stood abandoned, the flower fields grew wild without tending hands, and the grandmother remained frozen in her eternal prayer, unable to save her children, unable to do anything but witness the destruction of everything she had protected. The shamans, who had lived in such harmony with the world, who had never sought to harm anyone, were nearly wiped from existence. Their unique culture, their spiritual practices, their gentle way of life, all of it was obliterated in the Hornsent's quest for transcendence. But not every shaman was taken. A few somehow managed to hide or escape, and among them was Marika. Whether through luck or the intervention of some unknown protector, or perhaps already showing signs of the extraordinary nature that would later be recognized by the Two Fingers, Marika survived. She witnessed the destruction of her people. She saw her family, her friends, everyone she had ever known, dragged away to a fate she might have witnessed firsthand. The trauma of this must have been unimaginable. To be young, alone, surrounded by the ruins of your entire world, knowing that you survived when everyone else did not. What does such horror do to a person? How does it reshape them? The Marika we come to know in the lore, cold, calculating, willing to wage wars of extermination, sending her own children to their dooms to accomplish her goals. That Marika was forged in the ashes of the Shaman Village. Some see her later actions as monstrous, and perhaps they are. But they are the actions of someone who learned the fundamental lesson that the world taught her in the cruelest way possible, that the gentle and the peaceful are only prey for those with power and ambition, that mercy is a luxury afforded only to those strong enough to enforce their will. Years would pass, many years, for the Numen are long-lived. Marika would survive in the realm of shadow, in the lands controlled by the very people who had destroyed her village. We do not know the details of these years, but at some point, something extraordinary happened. The Two Fingers, mysterious agents of an outer god called the Greater Will, recognized something in her. They saw potential. They named her an Empyrean, one of those rare individuals capable of becoming a vessel for the Elden Ring itself, someone who could ascend to true godhood and rule over the lands between on behalf of the Greater Will. With this recognition came a gift of terrible significance. The Two Fingers gave Marika a shadow-bound beast, a loyal guardian designed to protect their chosen Empyrean and serve them without question. This guardian was Maliketh, and the description of him as Marika's half-brother has led to much speculation. Were they actually related by blood? Or is this a mistranslation, a misunderstanding of their spiritual bond? Maliketh would become one of the most feared beings in all the lands between, the Black Blade, guardian of destined death itself. But at the beginning, he was simply Marika's shadow, bound to her by divine mandate. Being named an Empyrean meant that Marika now had a path to power. But power alone was not enough. The Two Fingers, for all their divine authority, could not simply wave their hand and make her a goddess. No, there was a process, a gateway that had to be passed through. High above the realm of shadow, in a tower called Enya Ilim, there existed something called the Gate of Divinity. It was here that one chosen by the Fingers could shed their mortal form and become something more. Here that an Empyrean could ascend to godhood. But such ascension required something specific. It required the blessing of the Greater Will itself, delivered through the vessel of the Elden Ring. The Elden Ring was not originally in the lands between. Long ago, according to ancient texts, the Greater Will sent a golden star bearing a beast into this world. That beast would become the Elden Ring, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say the beast was the living manifestation of the ring's power. The Elden Beast, as it would come to be called, represented the Greater Will's physical presence in the lands between. Before Marika, before the age of the Erd Tree, the world was ordered differently. Ancient dragons ruled, with Placidusax serving as Elden Lord to a god whose identity has been lost to time. But that age passed, as all ages must, and the Greater Will sought a new order, a new god to serve as its vessel. Marika approached the Gate of Divinity. We can only imagine what she felt as she climbed toward that divine threshold. Did she go willingly, eagerly grasping at the power being offered? Or did she hesitate, understanding on some level the price that godhood would exact? There is a moment, captured in imagery we can find if we know where to look, of Marika at the gate, reaching toward golden threads that hang before her. She is about to take hold of them, to weave herself into the fabric of the world's very order. And then she does. The exact mechanism of her ascension is shrouded in mystery, but the result is clear. Marika became a god. The Elden Ring entered her, or she entered it, or perhaps the distinction ceased to matter. She became the vessel through which the greater will would exert its influence over the lands between. The Elden Ring, that abstract pattern of interlocking runes that defined the fundamental laws of reality, now resided within her body. She could shape it, mold it, remove pieces, add others. Through her, the very nature of existence in the lands between could be reordered. With her transformation complete, Marika the Shaman became Queen Marika the Eternal. The title was not mere bombast or royal pretension. By removing the rune of death from the Elden Ring and sealing it away, Marika had made herself and all those blessed by her grace effectively immortal. Death, as it had previously existed, ceased to have meaning for those under her rule. When someone died, their spirit would return to the Erd Tree's roots, and from there they would eventually be reborn. It was a cycle without end, a world where nothing truly concluded, hence eternal. The process of her ascension itself deserves deeper examination. When Marika passed through the Gate of Divinity in the Tower of Enir Ilim, she was fundamentally transformed. The Elden Ring, that abstract pattern of interlocking runes that represented the fundamental laws governing reality, entered her body and became part of her. Or perhaps more accurately, she became part of it, the distinction between Marika the person and Marika the vessel blurring until they were inseparable. The ring could not exist without her, and she could not exist as she was without the ring. This transformation granted her powers that went far beyond what any mortal could achieve. She could reshape the very laws of existence by altering the Elden Ring's composition. When she removed the rune of death, she did not simply hide death away. She fundamentally changed what death meant in the lands between. The boundary between life and death became permeable, a transition rather than a terminus. When she established the Golden Order's principles, she was not creating social laws or religious doctrines, but actual metaphysical rules that reality itself would obey. But this power came with a terrible price. As vessel of the Elden Ring, Marika became an instrument of the greater will, that mysterious outer god that had sent the Elden Beast to the lands between in a golden star long ago. The greater will sought to impose its vision of order on the world, and Marika was now the means by which it would do so. How much agency she retained, how much of her decisions were truly her own versus influences or commands from the greater will, remains one of the great questions of her reign. Based on what we know of her later actions, particularly her eventual shattering of the ring, we can infer that she chafed under this control even from the beginning. But in those early days, whether from belief in the greater will's vision or simple recognition that she had no choice, she threw herself into the work of building a new order. But eternity had to be built on foundations, and those foundations would be laid in blood. The lands between, in those early days, was not the unified realm we traverse as tarnished. It was a fractured landscape of competing powers, ancient orders that predated Marika's ascension and had no interest in bowing to this new goddess and her foreign god. The Erd Tree itself existed before Marika. It grew from what was called the Crucible, the primordial form where all life had once been blended together. But while the tree was ancient, Marika's Golden Order was something new, something that would reshape how people related to the Erd Tree and what it represented. The Golden Order was not simply a religious doctrine, but a complete reorganization of reality's fundamental laws. Under the Crucible's ancient influence, life had been chaotic, mutable, constantly shifting between forms. Creatures bore all manner of aspects: wings, tails, horns, scales, and these were not considered aberrations, but natural expressions of life's variety. The Golden Order changed this. It imposed categories, hierarchies, fixed definitions of what was proper and what was aberrant. Those born with horns or tails, those misbegotten creatures who bore traits of the crucible, were now considered cursed, impure, lesser beings who should be ashamed of their existence. This was a fundamental reimagining of the world's order. The flexibility and chaos of the crucible gave way to rigid structure and hierarchical thinking. There was the golden light of grace, and there was shadow. There were those blessed by the Erd Tree, and there were those cast out. There were proper forms of life, and there were abominations. Marika's golden order brought stability and immortality to those it favored, but it also created categories of exclusion that had not existed before. The omen, the misbegotten, those who worshipped other outer gods, all of these were defined as other, as wrong, as needing to be suppressed or destroyed. In those early days, everything was in opposition to the Erd Tree. Not to the tree itself necessarily, but to what Marika was making of it. She was declaring a new age, a new order, and that meant the old powers had to be removed. The most immediate threat came from the north, from the frigid peaks of the mountain-tops of the giants. There, the fire giants dwelled, worshipping the fell god, a deity whose flame held a terrible significance. The giant's flame of ruin was capable of burning the Erd Tree itself. As long as that flame existed, as long as the giants tended it, Marika's new order would never be secure. So Marika declared war. But she did not march to war herself. Gods rarely fight their own battles, and Marika was no exception. Instead, she took a consort, a mortal champion who would become the instrument of her will. His name was Huara Lu, and he was the most fearsome warrior in all the lands between. He was a chieftain of the Badlands, a man of such savage fury that he could barely be called civilized. His lust for battle was ceaseless, his rage without bottom. He was, in many ways, the opposite of everything Marika represented. Where she was divine grace and calculated purpose, he was mortal fury and unchained violence. But perhaps that was exactly why she chose him. Marika needed someone who could wage war without hesitation, without mercy, someone who would not flinch from the atrocities that conquest demands. And Huara Lu, for his part, saw in this union an opportunity to become something more than a barbarian chief. So he took on a new name, Godfrey. And to temper his endless bloodlust, to give him some measure of control, he took upon his shoulders a beast regent named Sarosh, a spectral lion that suppressed the worst of his savage nature. Civilized after a fashion, Godfrey became Marika's king consort and the first Elden Lord. Together, they marched north. Godfrey led Marika's armies against the fire giants in what would become known as the War Against the Giants. The fighting was brutal. The giants were massive, powerful, and they fought with the desperation of people who knew they were fighting for their very existence. But they could not stand against Godfrey and the forces of the Golden Order. One by one, the giants fell. Their settlements were razed. Their culture was destroyed. And in the end, only one giant remained. The war against the giants was more than just a military campaign. It represented the Golden Order's need to eliminate any force capable of threatening the Erd Tree itself. The giants worshipped the fell god, a deity whose flame, the flame of ruin, possessed a terrible property. This was not ordinary fire. The flame of ruin could burn the Erd Tree, could consume the very symbol and substance of Marika's power. As long as that flame existed, as long as the giants tended it in their forges atop the mountain tops, the Golden Order would never be truly secure. One determined giant, with access to the flame of ruin, could potentially undo everything Marika had built. The giant's connection to the fell god was deep and ancient. The fell god was described as a deity that lurked within the fire giants themselves, and sometimes even within fire itself. It was a god of flame and destruction, antithetical to the Erd Tree's life-giving golden light. The giants' smithing traditions were intimately bound up with this worship. They forged weapons in furnaces fed by the flame of ruin, creating implements of war that carried within them a spark of their god's destructive power. Their smithing stone tools, scattered across the mountaintops, tell a story of a people who had mastered fire in ways the Golden Order could never accept. Godfrey's Crucible Knights fought at the forefront of this war. These were warriors attuned to the powers of the Crucible itself, able to manifest aspects like horns and tails and wings, using the primordial life force that the Golden Order otherwise sought to suppress. Based on what we know of the Crucible Knights' abilities and their later presence in various locations, we can infer that they were instrumental in breaking the giants' defenses. Crucible Knights could survive blows that would kill normal soldiers, could heal from wounds that should have been fatal, could channel raw life force into devastating attacks. Against the giants' massive strength and flame magic, these knights were essential. The war culminated in a final confrontation at the Forge of the Giants, where the flame of ruin burned eternal. Marika herself was believed to have slain the fell god, though whether she actually killed the deity or merely defeated its physical manifestation is unclear. The description on the one-eyed shield claims it is believed that Queen Marika killed this evil deity, but the language is careful. Believed suggests uncertainty, propaganda, a story told rather than confirmed truth. What we know for certain is that the fell god's flame, the flame of ruin that could burn the Erd Tree, would not die. No matter what Marika did, no matter how thoroughly she thought she had extinguished it, the flame persisted. Unable to destroy the flame, Marika took a different approach. She cursed the last surviving giant, compelling him to tend the flame of ruin for all eternity. This was a punishment of exquisite cruelty. The giant would be forced to guard and maintain the very weapon his people had used to resist Marika, to keep it burning, but never to use it himself, to exist in perpetual servitude to the goddess who had destroyed his kind. The giant could not die, bound by Marika's curse to immortal suffering, and the flame could not spread, contained by the giant's enforced guardianship. It was a perfect prison for both prisoner and flame. Then Marika declared the path to the mountaintops forbidden. She established what became known as the Forbidden Lands, blocking access with magical seals and physical barriers. The war against the giants was to be forgotten, excised from history. Details of the conflict were deliberately erased from records. The giants' culture, their achievements, their smithing traditions, even their names, all of it was to disappear. Only the physical evidence remained. The giant corpses scattered across the mountaintops, impaled on massive spears, and the forge, where the last giant kept his eternal vigil over the flame that would not die. But the war against the giants was just one of many conflicts in those early days. Throughout the lands between, ancient powers contested Marika's claim to divinity. One of the most significant threats came from a figure known only as the Gloam-Eyed Queen. This mysterious Empyrean possessed something that made her extraordinarily dangerous to Marika's rule, the Rune of Death itself. Under the Gloam-Eyed Queen's leadership, the Godskin Apostles hunted gods with black flame, a power that could kill the divine. As long as the Gloam-Eyed Queen lived, as long as she wielded destined death, Marika's immortality and the immortality of her order meant nothing. So Marika sent Malekith. Her loyal shadow, her shadow-bound beast, confronted the Gloam-Eyed Queen and defeated her. The details of their battle are lost, but the outcome is clear. The Gloam-Eyed Queen was struck down, and the Rune of Death fell into Malekith's possession. But Marika did not simply destroy it or cast it aside. No, she saw utility in destined death. She commanded Malekith to seal the rune of death within his own being, within his black blade. This served multiple purposes. It removed true death from the world, making her Golden Order's promise of immortality actual rather than aspirational. It gave her control over death itself, making her the arbiter of who could die and who could not. And it bound Malekith even more completely to her will, for he now carried within him the one thing that could threaten her godhood. With the rune of death sealed away, Marika reshaped the Elden Ring and established her Golden Order. The fundamental laws of reality were rewritten according to her design. Death became a return to the Erdtree, not an ending, but a transition, a step in an endless cycle. Those blessed with her grace, the golden light that marked them as chosen, would be reborn over and over, their souls cleansed and renewed with each pass through the tree's roots. It was, in its way, a kind of paradise. No more fear of death, no more permanent loss. Everyone would live forever, in one form or another, under the Erdtree's golden light. But there were those for whom this paradise was not available. The Omen, those born with horns and considered cursed by the Golden Order, were excluded from the cycle of rebirth. The misbegotten, twisted beings associated with the Crucible's ancient power were hunted and enslaved. Those who worshipped other outer gods found themselves persecuted. Marika's order was golden, yes, but it was also rigid, inflexible. You were either within its light or cast into shadow. There was no middle ground. Still, for most people in the lands between, the early age of the Erdtree must have seemed like a genuine golden age. Peace reigned, at least after the initial wars of conquest were won. The Erdtree grew enormous, its canopy stretching across the sky, visible from anywhere in the realm. Its golden light suffused everything. People prospered, built great cities and roads, developed their arts and sciences. Leyndell, the royal capital, rose beneath the Erdtree itself, a monument to human achievement under divine guidance. And at the center of it all, in the heart of the Erdtree, sat Marika, eternal and unchanging, the axis around which the entire world turned. But even in those early triumphant days, seeds of doubt were being planted. Marika was not content to simply rule. She questioned. At the Church of the Minor Erdtree, she proclaimed her intention to search the depths of the Golden Order itself, to understand the principles that underpinned her reign. She declared that the age of blind faith was over, that understanding would be their path forward. This was a remarkable thing for a god to say. Gods typically do not encourage their followers to question or to seek deeper truths. They expect obedience, worship, submission. But Marika wanted something more, or perhaps she was already beginning to see the cracks in the foundation of her Golden Order. Because there were cracks, even then. The Erdtree had released golden seeds after sensing its own mortality for the first time, spawning the minor Erdtrees across the lands. This revealed something troubling. The Erdtree, and by extension the Golden Order itself, was not as perfect and eternal as people had been led to believe. If the tree could die, what did that mean for the immortality it promised? If the Order could fail, what became of all those who had structured their entire existence around its supposed permanence? During her marriage to Godfrey, Marika bore children. The first of these was Godwyn, called the Golden, and he was everything his parents could have hoped for. He was noble, powerful, beloved by all who knew him. He would go on to broker peace with the ancient dragons after defeating their leader Fortisax, bringing those mighty beings into alliance with the Golden Order. Godwyn was proof that the union of god and mortal could produce something extraordinary, a demigod who seemed to embody the best qualities of both his divine mother and his warrior father. But Godwyn was not Marika's only child with Godfrey. She also gave birth to twins, Morgott and Mohg, and unlike their elder brother, these two were cursed from birth. They were Omen, born with horns growing from their bodies, marked by what the Golden Order considered a vile affliction. In the society that Marika had built, omen children were typically killed at birth, their horns excised in a bloody ritual that usually resulted in their death. But these were the sons of a god and an Elden Lord. They could not be simply murdered like common omen children. Instead, Marika made a different choice, one that perhaps reveals more about her character than any amount of exposition could. She hid them away. Deep beneath Leyndell, in a place called the Subterranean Shunning Grounds, Morgott and Mohg were imprisoned. They were kept alive but out of sight, their very existence a secret known to only a few. To the public, Marika and Godfrey had one son, the glorious Godwyn. The twins were erased from the family history, buried in the dark, while their brother basked in the light above. The Subterranean Shunning Grounds tell their own story of horror. This was not a comfortable prison or a protected sanctuary. It was a sewer, a place where the capital's filth and refuse were channeled, where the city's unwanted omen were cast to live or die in darkness. The twins grew up surrounded by other omen who had been shunned, exiled, forgotten. They witnessed what their society considered people like them worthy of: disposal, erasure, elimination. Every day of their childhood would have reinforced the message that they were shameful, that their very existence was an embarrassment to be hidden away. The psychological impact of this treatment cannot be overstated. Imagine being born to the most powerful parents in the world, being descended from a goddess and the mightiest warrior in all the lands, and yet being treated as something too disgusting to acknowledge. Imagine having a brother who was celebrated, whose every accomplishment was trumpeted across the realm, while you rotted in sewers simply because of how you were born. Imagine knowing that the only reason you were alive at all was that your royal blood made you too important to kill like other omen children, but not important enough to be acknowledged as your mother's son. What must that have been like for Morgott and Mohg? To be the children of the most powerful beings in the world, and yet to be treated as shameful secrets? To see their brother celebrated while they rotted in sewers? They responded to their imprisonment in very different ways, and these responses shaped who they would become as adults and how they would act during the Shattering. Mohg embraced bitterness and rage. He rejected the Golden Order that had rejected him, and he sought power elsewhere. In the depths beneath Leyndell, Mohg made contact with an outer god called the Formless Mother, a deity of blood and wounds that existed beyond the Greater Will's influence. The Formless Mother taught Mohg her arts, the magic of blood and blood flame, powers that the Golden Order considered heretical. With this forbidden knowledge, Mohg grew strong enough to eventually escape his prison. He established his own realm, the Mohgwyn Palace, in an even deeper layer of the underground, where he ruled over a cult dedicated to the Formless Mother and pursued his own twisted ambitions involving his half-brother Miquella. Mohg's development of blood flame magic deserves particular attention. This was not simply fire, but blood that burned, a fusion of two destructive forces into something uniquely terrible. The Formless Mother's influence granted Mohg the ability to pierce flesh with blood flame talons, to cause blood loss with his cursed weapons, to surround himself with an aura of smouldering blood. His rejection of the Golden Order was so complete that he adopted aspects of an outer god antithetical to everything Marika represented. If the Golden Order was about fixed hierarchies and rigid categories, the Formless Mother represented the dissolution of boundaries, the mingling of blood, the breakdown of individual identity into collective suffering. Morgott, remarkably, chose a different path. Despite everything Marika had done to him, despite being hidden away like something shameful, he remained loyal to the Golden Order. He believed in it, believed in his mother's vision, believed that the system that had wronged him was nevertheless right and just. This loyalty is perhaps the most tragic element of the entire story. Morgott saw his horns as a curse, something he should be ashamed of, something that made him unworthy. He sealed away his accursed blood within a blade, concealing it within a wooden staff, hiding his true nature even from himself in a desperate attempt to be acceptable to an order that would never accept him. When he eventually emerged from his imprisonment, Morgott took the name Margit the Fell Omen and served as a defender of Leyndell. During the Shattering, when demigods attacked the capital seeking to claim the Elden Ring, Morgott repelled them again and again. He fought Radagon's armies. He humiliated Godric when the weak demigod attempted to assault the capital. He became known as the Veiled Monarch, defending a throne his mother would never return to, and an order that had only ever brought him suffering. His loyalty was absolute, even when it was not returned. He believed that service, that perfect devotion, might somehow make him worthy, might earn him the acceptance he craved. It never did. The parallel between the twins is striking. Both were cursed by their birth. Both suffered the same rejection and imprisonment, but they chose opposite responses. Mohg rejected the system entirely and sought power through alternative means, embracing the very things the Golden Order called heretical. Morgott internalized the system's judgment of him, accepted that he was shameful, and tried desperately to prove himself worthy, despite believing he never could be. Neither approach brought them happiness. Neither approach freed them from the trauma of their childhood. They remained, until their deaths, defined by what had been done to them in those dark years beneath Leyndell. But why would Marika do this to her own children? Why imprison them, rather than simply ending their lives if she found them so shameful? Some have speculated that it connects to her own trauma at the hands of the Hornsent. The Hornsent worshipped those born with horns, seeing such physical traits as divine blessings connected to the crucible. To the Hornsent, beings like Morgott and Mohg would have been holy. And Marika, who had suffered unspeakable horrors at Hornsent hands, could not bear to see her children bearing the same characteristics that the Hornsent revered. The horns were a reminder of her trauma, of her people's genocide. So she cast her horned children into darkness. It is a cruel irony. The shamans were victims of the Hornsent's religious obsessions, and Marika in turn made victims of her own children because they reminded her of the Hornsent. Trauma begets trauma, cycles of abuse perpetuating themselves across generations. Marika built a golden order, but she could not escape the shadows of her past. Those shadows infected everything she touched, including her family. As Godfrey continued to wage war on behalf of the Golden Order, conquering lands and bringing them under Marika's rule, the light in his eyes began to fade. There is a curious detail in the description of the Elden Lord's crown. When Godfrey's last worthy foe fell, the hue of his eyes dimmed. What does this mean? Was it literal, some visible sign that his battle spirit had finally been sated? Or was it metaphorical, indicating that he had lost his drive, his purpose? Godfrey was defined by combat, by the struggle against powerful enemies. With all resistance crushed, with no more great wars to wage, what was he? Whatever the reason, Marika deemed Godfrey no longer useful. Perhaps she never truly loved him. Perhaps their marriage was always a political arrangement, a necessary alliance to establish her power through conquest. Or perhaps she had loved him once, but that love could not survive once his purpose was fulfilled. Regardless, Marika made a choice that would have far-reaching consequences. She stripped Godfrey and his warriors of their grace. Grace, that golden light that marked the blessed of the Golden Order, was not just a visual indicator. It was the sign of the Erd Tree's favor, the mark of those who would be reborn when they died. To lose grace was to be cut off from the cycle of immortality that defined Marika's order. It was to become tarnished, a word that perfectly captured both the literal loss of golden light and the metaphorical stain on one's honor. Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, became the first tarnished. Marika banished him and all his followers from the lands between. She sent them forth on what would be called the Long March, commanding them to travel to distant lands and wage war there. And she made them a promise. She said that after their deaths, after they had grown strong in the face of death, their grace would be returned. They would be called back to the lands between to brandish the Elden Ring once more. It was a promise that sounded like mercy, but was actually something far more calculated. Marika was creating a contingency plan, a reserve force that would exist outside her realm, growing stronger through constant warfare, dying and being reborn elsewhere, becoming hardened veterans who owed nothing to the Golden Order as it currently existed. Why would she do this? What was Marika planning even then? The most common theory is that she was already considering betrayal, already thinking about shattering the Elden Ring and breaking free from the Greater Will's control. By creating the Tarnished, by keeping them outside the system, she was ensuring that when the time came, there would be warriors capable of challenging the order she had built. Warriors with nothing to lose and everything to gain. It was a gamble that would take centuries to pay off, but Marika was eternal. She could afford to think in those terms. Godfrey left the lands between with his warriors. They boarded ships at the southern peninsula and sailed away, their grace stripped, their immortality gone. The first Elden Lord became a chieftain in the Badlands, casting aside the civilized name of Godfrey and returning to his original identity as Hoara Lu. He and his warriors would fight and die in distant lands, their bones far from the Erd tree they had once served. And Marika, having shed her first consort like a snake discarding old skin, was now free to take a second. But before we speak of Radagon, Marika's second consort, we must address a child whose very existence was hidden from history. Messmer the Impaler, a son whose parentage has been the subject of much debate among scholars of the lore. Based on several pieces of evidence, his distinctive red hair that matches Radagon's, the presence of his own unique butterfly, much like those associated with Radagon's other children, and musical themes that echo Radagon's boss music, it seems most likely that Radagon was his father. However, the timing of his birth remains mysterious, as Marika could conceive with her other half at any point, making it difficult to place him definitively on the timeline. What we know for certain is that Messmer was cursed from birth with twin afflictions. Within him writhed an abyssal serpent, a creature of hunger and destruction that threatened to consume everything. And burning within him was a flame, a dark kindling that would never be extinguished, that brought him nothing but suffering. Marika looked upon her cursed son and felt fear. The serpent within Messmer terrified her so deeply that she plucked out his right eye and replaced it with a seal of grace, a crystal eye engraved with her own Elden rune. This seal was meant to contain the abyssal serpent, to keep it locked away where it could not threaten the world. But even with this seal in place, Marika's fear did not abate. She made a terrible decision. She would send Messmer away, hiding him in the realm of shadow, where no one would know of his existence, where his curse could be contained away from her shining capital. But Marika did not simply exile her son and forget about him. No, she had a use for Messmer. The Hornsent still controlled much of the realm of shadow. The people who had slaughtered the shamans, who had stuffed Marika's kin into jars and turned them into twisted parodies of life, still thrived in their towers and settlements. Marika wanted revenge. She wanted every last one of them destroyed. And she could not do this openly, could not associate herself publicly with such an act of genocide. It would undermine her image as a just and merciful goddess. So she commanded Messmer to wage a crusade. Not a war of conquest for the Golden Order, not an expansion of her territory, but a purge, a cleansing. Messmer was to burn the Hornsent from existence, to kill them all and leave no trace of their civilization. And because this could not be associated with her reign, because it was too brutal and too targeted to be part of the Golden Order's public narrative, she hid the realm of shadow itself. she sealed it away behind a veil, obscuring it from the knowledge of those in the lands between. There, out of sight and out of mind, Messmer could do what needed to be done. Messmer obeyed. He was a dutiful son, and despite the suffering his curse brought him, despite his mother's rejection, he carried out her will. He gathered an army, the Fire Knights who served him willingly, the Black Knights who formed his primary military force, and the common soldiers who followed him to war. He equipped his forces with weapons of terrible power. Furnace golems, enormous walking war machines designed to evoke the visage of the fell god that the Hornsent feared, were brought to the realm of shadow. Their very appearance was meant to terrorize, to invoke religious dread in the Hornsent who saw them coming. The crusade was not a war in any conventional sense. It was an extermination. Messmer's forces swept through the realm of shadow, burning Hornsent settlements, impaling their warriors on spears, destroying their temples and towers. The Tower of Aeonia Ilim, the very place where Marika had ascended to godhood, was sealed away behind shadowy thorns, ensuring that no one could pass through the gate of divinity again. The Hornsent culture, already wounded by Marika's earlier wars, was broken beyond all repair. The methods employed in this crusade deserve detailed examination. Messmer did not simply kill the Hornsent in battle. The impalement, his signature method, served multiple purposes. It was practical. Bodies displayed on spears sent a message to other settlements about what awaited resistance. It was psychological. The horror of seeing one's comrades and family members impaled created terror that demoralized defenders. And it was symbolic. The act of impalement, of piercing bodies and leaving them to die slowly, mirrored the spiritual violation the Hornsent had committed against the shamans. Where the Hornsent had stuffed shamans into jars, Messmer would mount Hornsent on spears. It was revenge-made methodology. The Fire Knights who served Messmer willingly were an elite force, warriors who had pledged themselves to him personally. These knights came from renowned families of the Erdtree's upper echelons, the nobility who should have been celebrating victories in the capital's courts. Instead, they followed Messmer into shadow and fire. They wielded his serpentine flame, attempting to let it inhabit them as it inhabited Messmer himself, though the flame would not find purchase within them as it did in its origin. So instead, they incanted his fire, channeling it through prayer and will rather than hosting it within their flesh. These Fire Knights faced unique challenges in the crusade. Unlike other soldiers who fought for glory or duty, the Fire Knights fought because they truly knew Messmer, understood his suffering, and chose to stand beside him despite the condemnation it brought upon their families. When they pledged allegiance to Messmer, they were shunned, chased from their homes, their noble families disowning them rather than be associated with the Impaler. Twinned golden snake adornments around their necks marked them as Messmer's servants, and these serpent symbols became marks of shame in the lands they had left behind. One Fire Knight in particular exemplifies the moral complexity of the crusade. Salza the Sage, disciple of the elder Wago, stood guard at a bridge leading to an old ruin, risking his life to protect a piece of history. The item description tells us he once asked whether reducing this land to ash, a land against which they held no grievance or ill will, made them any better than barbarians. His disdain for barbarism never waned, even as he burned more villages and scorched more land than any other Fire Knight. This internal contradiction, a man who hated what he was doing but continued doing it with exceptional effectiveness, speaks to the impossible position Messmer's closest companions found themselves in. Salza was instrumental in the creation of the specimen storehouse within the Black Keep. This was Messmer's museum, a place dedicated to preserving Hornsent culture, even as the Crusade systematically destroyed it. Loyal Hornsent scholars, described as folk of burned body and soul, tended this archive. These were Hornsent who had somehow survived the initial purges and then made the choice to serve their conquerors in exchange for protecting their people's history. What desperation, what hope, what calculation led them to this collaboration? They wore the robes of their scholarly tradition and incanted coils of Messmer's own fire, the same fire that had killed so many of their people, while maintaining the records and artifacts that proved their civilization had existed. Another of Salza's companions was Hilda, a fire knight who joined those urging that specimens be preserved. When Hilda died, their ashes were enshrined in the storehouse itself, becoming a charm to protect the place. This suggests Messmer honored those who showed mercy, who tried to preserve what the crusade destroyed. Based on what we know of his character from various descriptions and the specimen storehouse's existence, we can infer that Messmer was deeply conflicted about his mission. He carried it out with terrible efficiency, but he also tried to salvage what he could, to preserve some record that the Hornsent had been more than just targets for extermination. But the crusade stretched on far longer than anyone expected. Messmer and his forces were trapped in the realm of shadow, carrying out their brutal work with no sign from Marika that they could stop. Years became decades, became centuries. The soldiers who had followed Messmer, initially showered with grace and runes as rewards for their service, began to realize something horrifying. They would not be allowed to return. They would not be welcomed back to the lands between. When they died, they would not return to the Erdtree's roots like other blessed souls. They were exiles performing an unacknowledged war, and their deaths would be meaningless. The psychological toll of this realization broke many of them. Some turned to despair, abandoning the faith that had sustained them. These became the Thorn Sorcerers, practitioners who developed new sorceries based on spite and rejection. Their thorn spells were manifestations of how they viewed the Erdtree now, not as a source of blessing, but as something that should be spurned and wounded. The description of their sorceries makes it clear that faith had rewarded them with only despair, so they denounced their previous devotion and developed magic designed to harm that which they had once revered. Others found what solace they could in the Skadu tree, that twisted reflection of the Erdtree that existed in the realm of shadow. The Skadu tree was described as born of dark notions that bear no sense of order, a shadow of the Erdtree that represented everything Marika's Golden Order rejected. Yet for the abandoned Crusaders, it was all they had. The Skadu tree provided its own form of blessing, its own grace, though it was dark and hollow compared to the golden light they had lost. Blessed bone shards scattered throughout Messmer's fortifications testify to this alternate source of power. Bone fragments touched by the Skadu tree's gold, remains of fallen crusaders that had acquired power through their proximity to this shadow tree. The soldiers' armor tells us more about their state. The Skadu tree motif was engraved on their chest plates, a small consolation to those forced to wage a war without grace or honor. They wore this symbol because it was all that remained to them, not the Erdtree's proud golden light, but its shadow, its dark reflection, the twisted version that at least acknowledged their existence when their goddess would not. Remarkably, some tried to grow their own Erdtrees in the realm of shadow. In a small cave on Skadu Altus, we find a fledgling Erdtree being tended by perfumers, those skilled gardeners who understood the secrets of growth and cultivation. Another golden tree grows in a courtyard of the Shadow Keep itself. These were not the massive, minor Erdtrees scattered across the lands between but smaller saplings, desperate attempts to bring some piece of home into their place of exile. The perfumers worked tirelessly to keep these trees alive, perhaps hoping that if they could grow an Erdtree in shadow, it might somehow restore the connection they had lost, might bring back the grace that had been stripped from them. Messmer himself grew weary. He established the Shadow Keep as his stronghold, and rarely left it, brooding over the fate his mother had assigned him. He took no joy in his victories, no pride in the destruction he wrought. When he spoke, even in battle, his voice carried a tone of exhaustion. The words he uttered seemed rehearsed, tired repetitions of the Crusade's justifications. Only when he shattered the seal in his eye and unleashed the abyssal serpent within did his true feelings emerge. Mother, Marika, a curse upon thee. Some of Messmer's closest companions tried to preserve what remained of Hornsent culture. Salza, one of the Fire Knights, questioned the morality of their crusade, asking whether they were any better than barbarians for reducing to ash a land against which they held no personal grievance. At his urging, Messmer established the specimen storehouse within the Black Keep, a museum of sorts where artifacts and records of Hornsent civilization could be preserved. Loyal Hornsent scholars, folk of burned body and soul who had somehow survived, were allowed to tend this archive. It was a small mercy in the midst of genocide, but it was something. Messmer also created a wing of the Black Keep dedicated to caring for the Jar Saints, those twisted creations born from the Hornsent's Jar ritual. These were the remains of shamans, Marika's own people, and perhaps Messmer felt some kinship with them, some shared understanding of what it meant to be cursed and cast aside. The wing had fallen into ruin by the time we discover it, but its existence spoke to a gentler side of Messmer, a part of him that still tried to do good, even while carrying out atrocities. The crusade was the defining element of Messmer's existence, but it was not the only thing that shaped life in the realm of shadow during this period. Other important figures had come to the realm, drawn by various motivations. Radagon, sister to Queen Renala, had renounced her lineage and followed Messmer to war, proving her loyalty to the Erdtree through ritual combat in the arena. She wielded the power of the twin moons, and her magic had literally reshaped parts of the landscape, causing the town of Morgott to collapse into broken earth when her lunar vessel crashed down like a fallen moon. The Carians who followed Radagon had brought their own culture and traditions to the realm of shadow. Trolls, sworn to service, fought alongside Moonrithel, a knight who befriended these massive warriors and wielded their weapons in battle. But despite all these reinforcements, despite the overwhelming military superiority of Messmer's forces, the war never truly ended. There were always more Hornsent to fight, always more settlements to burn, always more enemies who refused to surrender. And through it all, Marika sent no word, gave no sign that the crusade could ever conclude. Messmer and his army were trapped in an eternal war with no victory condition, no endgame, no hope of reprieve. A phantom in Castle Ensis gives voice to the despair that had overtaken many. "Oh, Marika, I beg, embrace your child and give us a sign. How long must this holy war stretch on?" But Marika would never give that sign. She could not, for she had her own problems in the lands between. Problems that would ultimately lead to her shattering the Elden Ring itself and plunging the world into chaos. The crusade in the realm of shadow had become meaningless to her, forgotten in the face of her own struggles with the greater will. And so Messmer and his forces were abandoned, left to continue their war in shadow, while the rest of the world moved on without them. With Godfrey banished, and the Tarnished sent on their long march, Marika turned her attention to the one region of the lands between that had successfully resisted incorporation into her Golden Order. Aeonia, the land of lakes and mist, was ruled by the Academy of Raya Lucaria and the Carian royal family. These were practitioners of glintstone sorcery, scholars and warriors who drew their power not from faith in the Erdtree, but from the cosmos itself, from the stars and moon that hung in the night sky. They worshipped Queen Renala, a sorceress of extraordinary power who communed with the full moon and wielded magic that rivaled anything the Golden Order could produce. Aeonia's independence was unacceptable to Marika. A unified lands between under the Golden Order could not exist as long as Raya Lucaria stood apart, following its own traditions and acknowledging its own queen. So Marika declared war. But she did not lead this war herself, and she could not use Godfrey, who was now banished. Instead, she sent a champion, Radagon of the Golden Order. Radagon came at the head of a great golden host, and the First Leonian War began. It was a brutal conflict. The Carrion Knights and Sorcerers of Raya Lucaria were formidable opponents, and Renala herself commanded powers that seemed to defy the very laws of reality. The war raged back and forth, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. And then, something unexpected happened. Radagon and Renala met on the battlefield, and something passed between them. Love, perhaps, or recognition, or simply exhaustion with the meaningless conflict between their peoples. Radagon repented his territorial aggression. He traveled to the Church of Vows, a place sacred to the Carrion tradition, and cleansed himself with celestial dew in an act of ritual purification. Then he swore his love to Renala, and she accepted him. The war ended not in conquest, but in marriage. Radagon became king consort to the Carrion Queen, and through this union, the Academy of Raya Lucaria was brought into alliance with the Golden Order while maintaining much of its autonomy. The marriage produced 3 children. First came Praetor Rykard, a powerful sorcerer who inherited his mother's fascination with the arcane. He would go on to study forbidden hexes at Mount Gelmir and eventually build Volcano Manor there. Second was Starscourge Radahn, a warrior who inherited his father's red hair and grew to become one of the mightiest demigods in all the lands between. Radahn loved his childhood horse Leonard so dearly that he studied gravity magic under an alabaster lord, learning to manipulate gravitational forces so he could continue riding Leonard even as he grew to enormous size. And third was Lunar Princess Ranni, a sorceress like her mother, who was destined for extraordinary and terrible things. Ranni was special even among Marika's children and stepchildren. Like her mother, she had Empyrean blood. She was chosen by the Two Fingers as a potential successor to Marika, someone who could one day become a god and vessel for the Elden Ring. The source of her Empyrean status has long been debated. Some believe it came from being a child of Radagon, who was secretly the same being as Marika. Others point to the great rune of the unborn that Radagon gifted to Renala when they married, suggesting it might have been involved in Ranni's conception. Whatever the reason, Ranni was named Empyrean, and like all Empyreans, she was given a shadow-bound beast by the Two Fingers, the half-wolf Blade, who would serve as her loyal guardian. For years, this arrangement seemed stable. Radagon studied sorcery from his wife, delving into the mysteries of glintstone magic. He fathered children. He lived, by all appearances, as a devoted husband to Renala. The Second Leonian War, when it came, ended quickly with Radagon negotiating peace before it could escalate. Raya Lucaria's autonomy was maintained, and the Golden Order gained access to the sorceries and knowledge the Academy possessed. It seemed like an ideal situation for everyone involved. But then Godfrey was banished, and everything changed. Marika, now without an Elden Lord, summoned Radagon back to the capital. The nature of this summons is worth examining. Turtle Pope Miriel, when speaking of these events, notes the mystery of why Radagon would abandon Renala. After all, he had repented his aggression against her, sworn his love, built a life and family with her. What could compel him to leave? The answer, of course, is that Radagon was Marika, or more precisely, Radagon and Marika were the same being, 2 aspects of a single god. This truth was kept secret, hidden from everyone. A sculptor commissioned to create a statue of Radagon in Leyndell discovered this secret and hid it within his work, making it so the statue's true nature would only be revealed when the law of regression incantation was cast upon it. The statue would transform, showing Marika's form beneath Radagon's exterior. When and how this dual nature came to be is one of Elden Ring's greatest mysteries. Were they always the same person, with Radagon being Marika's male aspect given independent form? Did they merge at some point, two separate beings becoming one? Or was Radagon created by Marika deliberately, a separate identity she could inhabit to accomplish things she could not do as herself? The game provides no definitive answer, only hints and implications. What we know is that they were united in a single body when Marika called Radagon back to the capital. Whether Radagon wanted to return, or whether he had any choice in the matter, is unclear. Miriel's words suggest there might have been internal conflict, a struggle between Radagon's desire to remain with Rennala and Marika's need for him to serve as Elden Lord. But ultimately, Radagon returned. He abandoned his wife and children, leaving Rennala heartbroken, and eventually leading to her being deposed by the Academy and imprisoned in the Grand Library of Raya Lucaria, clutching the amber egg Radagon had given her as a parting gift. Radagon became Marika's second Elden Lord. His children with Rennala, Rikard, Radahn, and Ranni, were elevated to demigod status as Marika's stepchildren, officially bringing the Carrion line into the Golden Order's hierarchy. And then, Marika and Radagon had children of their own. This was different from her union with Godfrey. When a god reproduces with a mortal, the results are straightforward demigods. But when a god reproduces with themselves, when the same being conceives and births children, something goes wrong. The offspring are cursed. The twins born to Marika and Radagon were named Miquella and Malenia, and they were both Empyreans, like their mother and their half-sister Ranni. They had the potential to succeed Marika as god and vessel of the Elden Ring, but they were born afflicted in ways that would define their entire existence and, eventually, shape the fate of the lands between itself. Malenia was cursed with the scarlet rot, a disease of terrible significance. The rot was not merely an illness, but the influence of an outer god, a malevolent entity that existed beyond the lands between and sought to corrupt and consume everything it touched. From birth, the rot inhabited Malenia's body, slowly destroying her from within. It took her limbs first. Her right arm and legs had to be replaced with prosthetics crafted by a skilled needlemaker. But it did not stop there. The scarlet rot was always spreading, always consuming, always threatening to overwhelm her entirely. The progression of Malenia's affliction deserves closer examination. The scarlet rot was not content to simply destroy her flesh. It wanted to bloom, to flower forth from her body in the form of the Aeonian butterfly, spreading its corruption across the world. Malenia spent her entire life fighting this urge, suppressing the bloom with every ounce of her considerable will. She trained herself to compartmentalize the pain, to function despite losing limbs, to fight despite the constant degradation of her body. Her dedication to this suppression was so complete that she became known as Malenia, Blade of Miquella, defining herself not by her affliction, but by her service to her twin brother. The prosthetics she wore were masterworks of craftsmanship, created by a needlemaker of exceptional skill. Her right arm was fully artificial, yet she wielded her sword with such precision that she became perhaps the greatest sword fighter in all the lands between. Her legs, also prosthetic, carried her through countless battles without faltering. But these replacements were not just mechanical marvels. They were infused with unalloyed gold, the special material Miquella had developed to resist the influence of outer gods. The unalloyed gold helped keep the rot from spreading further, gave her precious stability in a body that was constantly trying to destroy itself. The needle Malenia carried was even more significant. This was no ordinary weapon, but an implement of profound power, able to temporarily stay the rot's influence and prevent it from blooming. The needle had to be repeatedly reapplied, a constant maintenance of the seal that kept the scarlet Aeonia from manifesting. Every time she used it, Every time she suppressed the bloom, she was choosing to continue fighting, to remain herself, rather than becoming a vessel for the outer god of rot. This choice defined her existence, the constant decision to remain Malenia, rather than become rot incarnate. Yet Malenia fought against her curse with a determination that became legendary. She trained to become one of the greatest sword masters in all the lands between, compensating for her prosthetic limbs with techniques so refined it surpassed that of warriors with intact bodies. She wielded a needle, a special implement that could temporarily stave off the rot's influence, keeping it from blooming into the catastrophic force it wanted to become. And she developed an identity around her devotion to her twin brother, becoming known as Malenia, Blade of Miquella, defining herself not by her curse, but by her purpose. Her fighting style reflected this dichotomy within her nature. She moved with grace that seemed impossible for someone with prosthetic limbs, her sword flowing through techniques called the waterfowl dance that combined aggression and artistry. Yet underlying every movement was the rot, waiting for any moment of weakness. In combat, Malenia could draw upon the rot's power, coating her blade with scarlet decay, causing the affliction to spread to those she struck. This was a calculated use of her curse, turning it from something that merely destroyed her into a weapon she could wield. But each time she used the rot, each time she let it express itself even slightly, she risked losing control entirely. The relationship between Malenia and Miquella was perhaps the most profound bond in all of Elden Ring's lore. They were twins born of a single god, both cursed from the moment of their birth, both marked as Empyreans, with the potential to succeed their mother. But where many siblings might have grown competitive or resentful, Malenia and Miquella became inseparable. Miquella dedicated his considerable intellect to finding a cure for Malenia's rot. Malenia dedicated her considerable martial prowess to protecting Miquella and carrying out his will. They were two halves of a whole, each providing what the other lacked. Miquella's curse was different, but no less terrible. He was frozen in eternal youth, his body forever that of a child, even as centuries passed. He possessed a mind of terrifying intellect and ambition, but he was trapped in a form that could never mature, never grow, never achieve the physical power his status as an Empyrean should have granted him. Some interpretations suggest his curse went even deeper, based on various item descriptions and quest outcomes that hint that his eternal youth meant all his plans were ultimately doomed to fail, that he was cursed to never achieve his ambitions, no matter how brilliant his schemes. The specific nature of Miquella's appearance deserves attention. He looked like a child of perhaps 10 or 12 years old, with golden hair inherited from his mother, and a delicate, almost ethereal beauty. But his eyes held the weight of centuries. His voice, when he spoke, carried authority that no actual child could muster. This disconnect between his appearance and his actual age, between his physical weakness and his intellectual strength, created unique challenges. He could not fight like Malenia. He could not inspire loyalty through physical prowess like Radahn. Instead, he had to rely on his mind, his charisma, his ability to understand people, and give them what they needed to follow him. And Miquella's mind was extraordinary. He was described as the most fearsome Empyrean of all, not because of physical power, but because of his ability to compel love and loyalty. This was not just natural charisma, but something deeper, something that bordered on supernatural influence. People who encountered Miquella found themselves devoted to him, willing to abandon everything they had known to serve his vision. This power made him dangerous in ways that physical might could never achieve, because he could turn enemies into allies, could build movements and cause shifts in loyalty that no army could accomplish. But Miquella did not accept his curse passively. He abandoned the Golden Order, recognizing that it offered no solution to his affliction or his sisters. The fundamentalism that his father Radagon championed, the deep study of the Golden Order's principles, was worthless when it came to curing scarlet rot or reversing eternal youth. Miquella studied the Golden Order's principles thoroughly, even creating incantations as gifts for his father, but ultimately concluded that fundamentalism could do nothing to treat Malenia's rot. This realization led him to seek answers outside the established order. So Miquella looked elsewhere. He developed his own unalloyed gold, a special material that was perfectly ordered and could resist the influence of outer gods. The creation of unalloyed gold represented a significant achievement in metaphysical research. Where the Golden Order's gold was connected to the greater will and carried that outer god's influence, unalloyed gold was pure, self-contained, resistant to all external divine manipulation. With this gold, he forged needles that could stay the rot's progression, giving his sister temporary relief from her suffering. These needles did not cure her, but they gave her stability, allowed her to live and fight rather than succumbing to corruption. But Miquella wanted more than temporary solutions. He wanted to cure Malenia completely, and he wanted to mature into true adulthood himself. To accomplish this, he created something extraordinary, the Haligtree. Using his own blood as a catalyst, Miquella grew a tree that would rival the Erd tree itself. The process of growing the Haligtree demonstrated Miquella's unique approach to solving problems. Where others might have sought power through conquest or divine favor, Miquella created life, nurtured growth, built something new rather than simply claiming what already existed. The Haligtree was meant to be an alternative to the Erd tree, a place where those rejected by the Golden Order could find sanctuary. The misbegotten, the Albinorics, the Omen who had escaped persecution, all could come to the Haligtree and find acceptance. This was Miquella's vision, a new order built not on rigid categories and exclusion, but on embrace of all life's variety. In this, he was trying to return to something like the Crucible's ancient acceptance of all forms, but with the order and structure that made civilization possible. And Miquella planned to embed himself within his tree, to let the Haligtree consume him slowly while he grew within its embrace. This was an extraordinarily risky plan, based on what we know of Numen abilities and the way shaman flesh could meld with living things. Miquella hoped that through this process he could achieve physical maturity, break free from his eternal childhood, and unlock the power to cure his sister. He entered a cocoon within the tree, surrendering himself to a transformation that might take decades or centuries to complete. But Miquella's plan was interrupted in the most brutal way possible. His half-brother Mohg, the Omen who had escaped from the subterranean shunning grounds, became obsessed with Miquella. Mohg served the Formless Mother, an outer god of blood and wounds, and he believed he could raise Miquella to godhood as a vessel for his deity. More than that, Mohg wanted to become Miquella's consort, to rule, beside him as king to Miquella's god. So Mohg did the unthinkable. He infiltrated the Haligtree and stole Miquella's body. Mohg took the still slumbering Miquella to Mohgwyn Palace, his realm hidden deep underground. There, he placed Miquella in a cocoon and attempted to share his blood with him, believing this would awaken the young Empyrean and accomplish Mohg's goals. But Miquella never responded. He remained in his cocoon, unmoving, either truly comatose or perhaps already gone, having abandoned his body to pursue some other path we could not yet see. Mohg's plan had failed, but he could not accept this. He continued to tend his stolen brother, waiting for an awakening that would never come. Malenia, discovering her brother's abduction, was devastated. Miquella was everything to her. He was working to cure her rot. He was the one person in the world who truly understood her struggle. And now he was gone, stolen away by their twisted half-brother. Malenia gathered her forces, the knights and soldiers who served the Haligtree, and began searching the lands between for any trace of Miquella. Her search would eventually lead her to Caelid, where she would face Star-Scourge Radahn in single combat. It would be a battle that neither combatant would survive intact. But before we discuss that climactic battle, we must address the other children in Marika's complex family. Ranni, Radagon's daughter with Rennala, had also rejected the path laid out for her. As an Empyrean, she was meant to eventually succeed Marika, to become the next vessel for the Elden Ring and rule the lands between on behalf of the Greater Will. But Ranni wanted none of it. She had seen what godhood had done to Marika, the loss of agency, the imprisonment within duty, the inability to truly live. Ranni wanted freedom, and she was willing to pay any price to achieve it. Radahn, meanwhile, had grown into perhaps the mightiest warrior among all the demigods. He held his territory of Caelid with an iron grip, and his power was so great that he could literally hold back the stars themselves, freezing the fate of everything in the lands between. His half-brother Ricard had gone down a very different path, studying forbidden sorceries at Mount Gelmir, and eventually feeding himself to the god-devouring serpent, becoming one with the massive creature in a blasphemous union that horrified everyone who learned of it. And throughout all of this, Marika watched from within the Erd Tree. She had accomplished what she set out to do. She was eternal, immortal, a god with demigod children who could perpetuate her line and her rule. The Golden Order seemed secure. The lands between were united under her authority. But inside, questions gnawed at her. The nature of the Golden Order troubled her. The Greater Will's control over her troubled her even more. She had escaped one form of slavery under the Hornsent, only to find herself bound by divine chains that were far more difficult to break. In the Golden Age of the Erd Tree, during a time when Marika's rule seemed secure and eternal, something unprecedented occurred. On a night of wintry fog, assassins entered Leyndell, the royal capital itself, and murdered a demigod. Not in battle, not in some distant war, but in the heart of Marika's power. They killed Godwyn the Golden, the beloved first son of Marika and Godfrey, and they did it with weapons that should not have existed, black knives imbued with the power of destined death. The planning that went into this assassination reveals layers of conspiracy and calculation that we are still unraveling. The rune of death had been sealed away by Maliketh, locked within his black blade, where it could not threaten the immortality that defined the Golden Order. Maliketh was absolutely loyal to Marika, bound to her as her shadow-bound beast, and his entire purpose was to guard this rune. For anyone to steal even a fragment of it would require either overpowering Maliketh, something almost unthinkable given his fearsome reputation, or betraying him in a way he would never anticipate. That someone was Ranni, and based on what we know from various item descriptions and NPC dialogue, we can infer that the theft was an act of tremendous daring and ruthlessness. Ranni needed the Rune of Death to free herself from the Two Fingers' control, but she could not simply take the whole rune. That would have been impossible. Instead, she stole a fragment, a piece small enough that perhaps Maliketh did not immediately realize what had been taken, but large enough to serve her purpose. The theft itself represented a betrayal not just of Maliketh, but of Marika, since Maliketh was Marika's loyal servant, and stealing from him was stealing from the goddess herself. With the stolen fragment, Ranni performed what she describes as a fearsome ritual to forge the god-slaying black knives. The ritual's nature is not detailed in any item description, but the results speak to its effectiveness. These knives could kill even immortal demigods, could bypass the protections that Marika had woven into the Golden Order when she removed the Rune of Death. The blades were oddly misshapen, their forms warped by the power infused within them, and they carried within their steel the essence of destined death itself. Ranni gave these weapons to assassins, all of them women, all of them Numen, the same race as Marika herself. This detail is profound in its implications. The assassins were described as rumored to be Numen, who had close ties to Marika, not distant relations or fellow members of the race, but people who had close ties to the goddess herself. This suggests they were part of Marika's inner circle, people she trusted, people who had access to the capital and the resources to carry out such an audacious attack. The fact that they wore armor designed to make no sound, cloaks that fooled the eye, suggests they had intimate knowledge of Leyndell's defenses and patrol patterns. This raises the question that has plagued scholars of Elden Ring's lore since the beginning. Was Marika involved in the plot to kill her own son? The Black Knife assassins were Numen with close ties to her. The assassination served Ranni's purposes, but it also created the crisis that would allow Marika to shatter the Elden Ring. Some interpretations of the evidence suggest that Marika and Ranni may have been co-conspirators, each using the other to accomplish their own goals. Ranni wanted to escape her Empyrean fate. Marika, based on her later actions, appears to have wanted to rebel against the greater will. The Knight of Black Knives served both purposes. However, this interpretation is not definitively proven by any item description or dialogue. What we can say with certainty is that the assassins had close ties to Marika, and that her reaction to Godwyn's death was to shatter the Elden Ring shortly afterward. Whether this was grief-driven madness or calculated rebellion, whether she knew beforehand or discovered the plot only after its completion, remains one of the great mysteries. But if she was involved, it would mean Marika arranged the murder of Godwyn, her most beloved child, the son who had never disappointed her, the one who brokered peace with the ancient dragons and brought glory to her name. What kind of desperation, what kind of calculation would lead a mother to sacrifice her favored son? The only explanation that makes sense is that Marika saw no other way to break free from the greater will's control. Godwyn's death would justify shattering the ring in a way that mere rebellion could not. It would create chaos, confusion, a moment where she could act before the greater will and its servants could stop her. These Black Knife assassins wore armor that made no sound, and cloaks that fooled the eye. They moved through Leyndell like ghosts, and when they reached Godwyn, they carved the curse mark of death into his flesh. But this was not a normal assassination. Ranni had orchestrated something far more complex and terrible. In the same moment that the assassins killed Godwyn, Ranni killed herself. The curse mark of death was meant to form a complete circle, but with two deaths occurring simultaneously, it split into two half-wheels. Godwyn's soul alone perished while his body lived on, and Ranni's body alone perished while her soul survived. The splitting of the curse mark created unique forms of death that had never existed before. Godwyn became the Prince of Death, the first of those who live in death, his soulless body spreading corruption through the Erd Tree's roots. Ranni became a spirit inhabiting a doll, her soul preserved while her flesh was burned. Both achieved a kind of escape from the cycle Marika had created. Godwyn could not return to the Erd Tree because his soul was gone, and Ranni would not return because her body was gone. They had slipped between the categories Marika had established, found gaps in. The system proved that the Golden Order's control over death was not as absolute as it seemed. Godwyn's corpse was interred in the roots of the Erd Tree beneath Leyndell, in the deep-root depths, where the tree's massive roots sprawled through underground caverns. But because his soul was dead while his body lived, he did not return to the cycle of rebirth. Instead, he began to mutate, to transform into something horrific. His body spread like a cancer through the Erd Tree's roots, his dead eyes multiplying across his corpse, his form becoming more grotesque with each passing day. He became the first of those who live in death, and through the roots he touched, the power of destined death began to spread as deathroot, infecting the land and allowing others to escape the cycle of rebirth that Marika had imposed. The impact of Godwyn's death cannot be overstated. He was the first demigod to die in all of history. The immortal had been proven mortal. The children of a god could be killed. This revelation shook the foundations of the Golden Order. If demigods could die, if destined death could be unleashed despite Malekith's guardianship, then what else that they believed was eternal could be destroyed? The certainty that had defined the age of the Erd Tree evaporated in a single night. Marika's reaction to Godwyn's death was immediate and catastrophic. She was said to have been driven to the brink, her grief and rage overwhelming her divine composure. Godwyn had been her favored child, the son who embodied everything she had hoped her line would produce. And now he was gone, transformed into a mockery of life, his corpse spreading corruption through the very roots of her sacred tree. Some accounts suggest Marika actually instructed her demigod children to fight for the positions of Elden Lord and Godhood, essentially declaring that a war of succession was now in effect. But whether this was her intent, or the demigods simply interpreted her breakdown as permission to pursue power, the result was the same. Conflict was coming. But before the Shattering could begin, Marika did something that no one anticipated. In a moment of either madness or ultimate clarity, she took her hammer, the very same Numen hammer she had carried from her homeland, and she used it to shatter the Elden Ring itself. The artifact that defined reality, that maintained the Golden Order, that kept the Greater Will's influence anchored in the lands between, she broke it. The ring splintered into fragments called great runes, each one containing immense power, and these fragments were scattered across the realm. Why would Marika do this? Why would she destroy the very foundation of her own power? The most common interpretation is that she was rebelling against the Greater Will itself. For centuries, perhaps millennia, she had served as the vessel for the Elden Ring, allowing the Greater Will to shape the world through her. She had been the god of the Golden Order, but had she ever truly been free? Or was she just as much a prisoner as the omen she had locked beneath Leyndell, just as much a victim as her son Messmer, burning away his life in the realm of shadow? In that moment of shattering, Marika may have been attempting to kill the Elden Beast, to destroy the Greater Will's hold over the lands between, to finally free herself and the world from divine tyranny. Or perhaps it was simply grief, an act of rage and despair over losing Godwyn, a violent rejection of everything she had built, because it had all been for nothing, if her beloved son could still die. We may never know her true motivations, but the consequences were immediately clear. Radagon, Marika's other half, attempted to repair the Elden Ring. While Marika was trying to destroy it, Radagon was trying to fix it, using the same hammer for opposite purposes. This internal conflict, this war within a single body, between the part that wanted to rebel and the part that remained loyal to the Golden Order, represented everything broken about Marika's existence. She could not even destroy the system that imprisoned her without fighting herself. The Greater Will's response was swift. Marika, and by extension Radagon, was imprisoned within the Erd Tree. The Elden Beast, that golden dragon that served as the Greater Will's physical manifestation, crucified her upon a rune arc matching the shape of her own symbol. She was suspended there, shattered and unresponsive, the Elden Ring still glowing within her broken body, but its fragments now scattered across the world. The goddess who had ruled the lands between was now a prisoner in her own sacred tree, unable to act, unable to speak, able only to exist as a vessel, while the world she had built tore itself apart. With the Elden Ring shattered and Marika imprisoned, the great runes that had splintered from the ring called out to her demigod children. These fragments of divine power granted immense strength to whoever possessed them, but they also corrupted, twisted, magnified the worst qualities of their bearers. Each demigod who claimed a great rune became a shard-bearer, and the taint of their newfound power triggered something terrible. They warred against each other, each seeking to claim enough fragments to remake the Elden Ring, to become the new Elden Lord, or even a new god. This was the Shattering, a war that would rage for what seems to have been centuries, turning the lands between into a nightmare landscape of endless conflict. Morgott, despite being an omen, despite being cast into the sewers as a child, remained loyal to Leyndell and the Golden Order. He took on the identity of Morgott the Fell Omen and fought to defend the capital against all comers. Multiple times, Leyndell was besieged. Radagon's forces attacked from Caelid. Ricard's recusants from Volcano Manor launched their own assault, and each time, Morgott repelled them, proving himself the veiled monarch, the defender of a throne his mother would never return to, and an order that had only ever brought him suffering. Godric, a distant descendant of Godwyn, and therefore part of the Golden Lineage, also possessed a great rune. But unlike his illustrious ancestor, Godric was weak. He fled from battle after battle, humiliated by Morgott in Leyndell, and later defeated by Malenia when her forces passed through Limgrave. Godric became obsessed with overcoming his inadequacy, turning to the forbidden practice of grafting, attaching the body parts of defeated warriors to his own form in a grotesque attempt to accumulate power. He became the Grafted, ruling over Stormvile Castle as a petty tyrant, feared more for his cruelty than respected for any accomplishment. Mohg, in his Mohgwyn Palace, continued his blood rituals and worship of the formless mother, building a cult around himself and his stolen brother Miquella. Ricard, now merged with the god-devouring serpent, declared that his manor would be a haven for those who wished to destroy the Golden Order, gathering recusants who would hunt tarnished and demigods alike, feeding them all to Ricard to increase his power. The serpent would devour the very gods if given the chance, growing stronger with each meal, becoming more grotesque with each fusion. But the most significant battle of the Shattering, the one that would have the greatest impact on the world, was the confrontation between Malenia and Radahn in Caelid. Malenia, still searching for her abducted brother, somehow came to believe that Radahn possessed information about Miquella's location. Or perhaps she simply sought to claim his great rune, thinking its power might help in her search. Regardless of her motivation, she marched her forces into Caelid and challenged the Starscourge to single combat. The battle was everything two demigods at full power could make it. The forces that witnessed this confrontation described it in terms that bordered on mythological. Radahn, massive and terrible, wielded gravity magic that could pull meteorites from the sky and crush opponents under impossible weight. His twin greatswords, each longer than a grown man, swept through the battlefield with devastating force. He fought from atop Leonard, his beloved childhood horse, and despite Radahn's enormous size, the tiny steed carried him with unwavering loyalty, thanks to the gravity magic Radahn had mastered specifically so he would never have to abandon his companion. Malenia approached this battle with all the skill she had honed over centuries of training. Her prosthetic limbs moved with fluid grace, her blade an extension of her will. She employed the waterfowl dance, a technique where she would leap into the air and strike multiple times in rapid succession, her movements so fast they blurred together. Her sword had been forged specifically to handle her unique needs, light enough for her to wield with perfect control despite her prosthetics, sharp enough to pierce even the toughest armor. The two had actually known each other in their youth. Based on various item descriptions and dialogue, we can infer that Radahn and Malenia were both raised in Leyndell during their childhoods, when Radahn's father Radagon had returned to become Elden Lord. They might have trained together, perhaps even been friends before the Shattering turned all the demigods into enemies. This made their battle even more tragic. These were not strangers meeting in combat, but siblings, or step-siblings, depending on how one counts Radagon's children in relation to Marika's, forced to fight to the death by the chaos their mother had created. Radahn's mastery of gravity magic gave him unprecedented control over the battlefield. He could increase the weight of his enemies, crushing them into the ground. He could reduce his own weight to leap impossible distances. He could pull opponents toward him or send them flying away. Most significantly, he had grown powerful enough to hold back the stars themselves, literally freezing celestial bodies in place, and thereby freezing the fates of all in the lands between. This was power on a cosmic scale, and it made him arguably the most formidable warrior among all the demigods. But Malenia was unmatched in pure swordsmanship. Her technique was so refined that she could deflect Radahn's massive strikes, could find openings in defenses that should have been impenetrable, could dance through attacks that would have obliterated lesser warriors. Her blade of Miquella, the prosthetic sword arm she wielded with such precision, carried within it all her devotion to her brother, all her determination to find him and bring him back. She fought not just for victory, but for Miquella, and that gave her strength beyond what physical power alone could provide. The battle stretched on, neither able to overcome the other. Radahn's gravity magic clashed against Malenia's swordsmanship. The Star Scourge fought from his mounted position, using Leonard's mobility to keep distance and unleash devastating ranged attacks. Malenia closed that distance again and again, her sword finding flesh, drawing blood, but never landing the killing blow. Both were exhausted, pushed beyond their limits, wounds accumulating as the fight dragged on. And in that moment of exhaustion, when victory seemed impossible and defeat loomed, Malenia made her desperate choice. And then Malenia did something desperate, something terrible. She had never wanted to let the scarlet rot bloom, had spent her entire life fighting to contain it, using Miquella's needles to keep it suppressed. But now, facing defeat, she made a choice. She let the rot flower. The scarlet Aeonia bloomed across the battlefield, a massive flower of pure corruption that released the rot in its most devastating form. The flower bloomed from Malenia herself, bursting forth from her body, and when it spread, it transformed Caelid into a hellscape. The bloom was described as a catastrophic event, a moment when the outer god of rot expressed its full power through Malenia's body. The flower itself was enormous, petals of scarlet corruption spreading across the battlefield, releasing spores and essence that infected everything they touched. This was not the controlled use of rot that Malenia had employed in previous battles, where she coated her blade with decay. This was the rot unleashed, uncontrolled, expressing its fundamental nature as a force of consumption and transformation. The rot consumed everything. Radahn's soldiers died screaming as their flesh sloughed from their bones. The very land was infected, turned into a festering wasteland of scarlet pools and grotesque mutations. Trees became twisted things, their bark splitting to reveal red growths beneath. The ground itself seemed to rot, becoming soft and treacherous, releasing foul vapors that choked anyone who breathed them. Wildlife was transformed into horrible mutated versions, dogs and crows and creatures we cannot even name twisted into new forms by the rot's corrupting influence. And Radahn himself, despite his godlike power, was overcome. The rot invaded his body, ate away at his mind, reduced the mighty Star Scourge to a savage beast. He survived, if you could call it survival, but his sanity was gone. He wandered Caelid as a mindless creature, his once keen intellect reduced to animal instinct, still riding Leonard despite having long since lost the ability to remember why. His forces, those who survived, organized what they called the Festival of Radahn, a tournament where warriors could compete for the honor of giving their general a glorious death. They could not bear to see him reduced to this state, and death seemed the only mercy left to offer. Malenia collapsed after unleashing the bloom, her body barely clinging to life. The rot had flowered through her, and though she had used it as a weapon, it had also consumed more of her in the process. Based on what we find when we encounter her in the Haligtree, we can infer that she fell into a kind of coma after the battle, her consciousness retreating deep within to survive the trauma of what she had done. Her loyal knight, Finley, found her on that devastated battlefield and carried her all the way from Caelid back to the Haligtree, an act of devotion that has become legendary. The journey from Caelid to the Halig Tree was immense, crossing multiple regions, through hostile territory, while carrying a comatose demigod. Finley accomplished this alone, protecting Malenia from all who would seek to finish what Radahn had started, navigating paths through lands torn by war, never resting until she had brought her mistress home. When we find Finley's ashes in the game, the description tells us she was one of the few gallant enough to serve Malenia the Severed, suggesting that many others abandoned the goddess after the Battle of Aeonia, unwilling to remain loyal to someone who had unleashed such devastation. Malenia survived. But she had become something different. She was no longer just Malenia, blade of Miquella. Now she was Malenia, goddess of rot, the Scarlet Aeonia, having transformed her into an avatar of the very outer god she had spent her life resisting. The bloom had changed her fundamentally, made her something other than what she had been. When we encounter her in the Halig Tree, she sits upon a throne at the base of the tree, waiting. Perhaps hoping Miquella would return, perhaps simply too damaged to do anything else. The woman who had been the finest sword fighter in all the lands, between now existed in a state between life and something else, goddess of an affliction she had always hated, guardian of a brother who was no longer there to guard. The Battle of Aeonia ended in a stalemate, but its consequences reshaped the war. Radahn, who had been using his gravity magic to hold back the stars and thus freeze the fates of all in the lands between, could no longer maintain his spell. With his mind gone, the stars fell, and fate began moving again. This had profound implications, particularly for Ranni, whose destiny had been locked by Radahn's magic. Now, with the stars freed, she could pursue her plan to ascend and replace Marika as the god of a new age. The Shattering continued, but without resolution. Battle after battle was fought. Morgott held Leyndell against all comers. Ranni's forces clashed with Carian loyalists. Rykard consumed everyone foolish enough to enter Volcano Manor. And through it all, the Greater Will's grace abandoned the demigods. They had failed. They had taken the great runes and become corrupted by them, waging endless war instead of restoring order. So the Greater Will enacted the contingency plan that Marika herself had set in motion so long ago. The grace of the Erd Tree was returned to the Tarnished. Across distant lands, in places far from the lands between, the Tarnished felt something they had not felt in generations. Grace, the golden light that had been stripped from Godfrey and his warriors, returned. It appeared before them as guidance, spectral light pointing the way home. And with that return of grace came resurrection for those who had already died. Godfrey, who had perished as Huara Lu in the Badlands, awoke. Other tarnished warriors, dead for years or decades or centuries, opened their eyes once more, and they were called back to the lands between, to wage war and brandish the Elden Ring, just as Marika had promised them so long ago. The Tarnished returned to find a broken world. The lands between had become a nightmare of endless conflict and decay. The Erd Tree, once glorious and golden, was now surrounded by thorns that prevented anyone from entering. Demigods fought each other in stalemates that had lasted longer than most mortal lifetimes. Those who live in death wandered the land, spreading deathroot and corruption. The scarlet rot had turned entire regions into toxic wastelands, and through it all, no one could reach Marika, imprisoned within the Erd Tree, to properly restore the Elden Ring. The Round Table Hold became a gathering place for the returned Tarnished. There, the Two Fingers instructed them in their purpose. Seek the great runes held by the demigods, slay the Shardbearers, claim their power, and use it to enter the Erd Tree and become the new Elden Lord. It was a simple plan, though executing it would require killing some of the most powerful beings in existence. But the Tarnished had been chosen by grace, granted a form of immortality that allowed them to return from death again and again. They could afford to be persistent. Among the tarnished were many notable individuals. Vike, a knight who came closer than anyone else to becoming Elden Lord before being consumed by frenzy. Fear, who offered comfort to the dead and pursued her own agenda related to those who live in death. Dung Eater, whose title perfectly captured his revolting nature, sought to curse all of existence with his seedbed curses. Goldmask, a scholar of fundamentalism who questioned the very nature of the Golden Order and sought to perfect it. And many others, each with their own goals, their own interpretation of what becoming Elden Lord would mean. But the story of the Tarnished is not our focus here. Our focus remains on Marika, imprisoned within the Erd Tree, shattered and silent. What did she think, suspended there for what might have been centuries? Could she think at all, or was her consciousness fractured along with her body? Radagon dwelt within the same form, the two of them bound together in mutual imprisonment. Did they speak to each other in that darkness? Did they argue about the decision to shatter the ring? Or had they moved beyond such things, reduced to nothing more than vessels waiting for someone, anyone, to break the cycle? Throughout the lands between, at specific sites of grace found in churches dedicated to her, Marika's words still lingered. These were echoes of speeches she had given, declarations she had made at crucial moments in her reign. Malenia, the mysterious woman who serves as maiden to the tarnished protagonist, could recite these words if she traveled with them to the correct locations. Through these echoes, we learn more about Marika's thoughts and motivations. At one church, Marika speaks of her search to understand the depths of the Golden Order, declaring that the age of blind faith is over and understanding will be their path forward. At another, she addresses Godfrey and his warriors, commanding them to leave the lands between and promising their eventual return. At a third, she reflects on her enemies and what she learned from them, suggesting that the giants and their flame of ruin were merely tools in the hands of a greater threat, the fell god that lurked within the flame itself. But perhaps the most revealing echo is the one where Marika addresses Radagon. O Radagon, leal hound of the Golden Order, thou art yet to become me. Thou art yet to become a god. Let us be shattered both, mine other self. These words suggest that even before the physical shattering of the Elden Ring, Marika and Radagon were already divided. Radagon had not yet fully merged with Marika, not yet become the unified being they would eventually be. And Marika was proposing, perhaps predicting, that they would both be shattered. Was this a warning? A plan? A prophecy she spoke to herself? We know that Marika communed with various outer gods and powers beyond the greater will. She met with the Three Fingers, who offered the flame of frenzy as an alternative to the Golden Order. She understood that the greater will was not the only cosmic force that sought to influence the lands between. And perhaps, in her imprisonment and study, she came to realize that the greater will itself had been absent for eons, that the Two Fingers had not received guidance from their supposed master in longer than anyone knew. This would make the Golden Order a house built on foundations that had long since crumbled away, a religion worshipping a god that had abandoned them without anyone realizing it. When a Tarnished finally succeeds in claiming enough great runes and burns the Erd Tree with flame capable of destroying its thorny seal, they gain entrance to the interior where Marika has been imprisoned. What they find is both tragic and terrible. Marika hangs suspended on the rune arc, her body clearly shattered, held together only by divine will, or perhaps the Elden Ring itself, which still glows within her. As they approach, something changes. Marika is suddenly released from her bonds, and her hair immediately shifts from golden blonde to crimson red. Radagon asserts control of their shared body. The battle that follows is Radagon of the Golden Order fighting to defend the Elden Ring and prevent its repair or transformation. He wields Marika's hammer, the same weapon used to shatter the ring, and his attacks carry the weight of desperate loyalty to the system he served. Radagon represents everything about the Golden Order that Marika came to hate: the rigid adherence to rules, the unwavering faith, the refusal to question or change, even when that change is desperately needed. That they share a body, that they are the same being, makes their conflict all the more tragic. After defeating Radagon, the Tarnished faces the Elden Beast itself, the living manifestation of the Elden Ring and the Greater Will's direct presence in the lands between. The beast rises from Radagon's body, transforming his corpse into a massive sword that it wields against the Tarnished. This final battle determines the fate not just of the Elden Ring, but of the entire world's order. And when the Elden Beast falls, when the Tarnished claims victory, they have a choice. Multiple paths lie before them, each representing a different vision for the future of the lands between. If they choose to mend the Elden Ring, Marika's shattered body is restored. Her head returns to her shoulders, her form becomes whole once more. The Tarnished becomes the third Elden Lord, effectively Marika's new consort, and a new age begins. Whether it's a simple restoration of the Golden Order, a perfected version following Goldmask's research, an age where those who live in death are accepted following Fear's blessing, or an age of despair following Dung Eater's curse. If they choose Ranni's path, if they've fulfilled her quest and summoned her to the Erd Tree, something different happens. Ranni picks up Marika's head gently, almost tenderly, and then both Ranni and Marika's body dissolve into light, dissipating peacefully. This ending represents a complete departure from the Greater Will's influence, an age of stars and moon, of freedom from the outer gods that have manipulated the lands between for so long. And if they choose the frenzied flame path, if they've let the three fingers mark them and accepted the blessing of chaos and madness, Marika's head breaks apart and crumbles to ash in their hands. This is the ending where everything burns, where the lands between is reduced to nothing, where the cycles and systems and divine manipulations all end because existence itself ends. It is apocalypse, rejection of not just the Golden Order, but all order, a return to the primordial chaos that existed before anything was separated or defined. In every ending except Ranni's and the frenzied flames, Marika remains as a vessel for the Elden Ring. She is restored but unresponsive, her consciousness seemingly absent or unreachable. The ring glows within her once more, and the new Elden Lord rules through her as she once ruled through the Greater Will's authority. She has become a symbol more than a person, a divine mannequin that gives legitimacy to whoever holds power. Whether this is better or worse than her imprisonment on the Rune Ark is debatable. At least when she was shattered, she was free from being used. Now she's whole but hollow, present but absent, a goddess who has become nothing more than a pedestal for another's ambition. What would Marika think of these endings if she could think? Would she approve of any Tarnished's choice? Or would she rage that even in victory, even in defeating the Elden Beast itself, the new Elden Lord still uses her as a vessel? Or would she be grateful simply to be free from the active conflict, content to exist as a passive receptacle if it means the fighting stops? We cannot know. Marika, who shaped the lands between for an age, who rose from humble shaman to eternal goddess, who suffered and caused suffering in equal measure, has no voice in her own fate at the story's end. Her legacy, however, is undeniable. Every demigod in the lands between traces their lineage to her. The entire Golden Order, with all its beauty and brutality, was her creation. The shattering happened because she chose to shatter the ring. The return of the Tarnished happened because she banished them with the promise of return. Even those who live in death exist because her attempt to control death through sealing the rune of death created the conditions for its theft and misuse. The lands between is the world Marika made, for better and worse, and everyone who lives in it does so under the shadow of her choices. Throughout this telling, we have traced Marika's path from shaman to goddess to prisoner. We have seen how trauma shaped her, how power changed her, how the systems she built to protect herself and her people ultimately became instruments of oppression in their own right. She is perhaps the most complex character in all of Elden Ring's lore, neither hero nor villain, but something far more nuanced and tragic. When we consider Marika's actions, the genocide of the Hornsent, the exile of her husband, and creation of the Tarnished, the imprisonment of her omen sons, the abandonment of Messmer in the realm of shadow, we see cruelty. We see a willingness to sacrifice others, even her own children, for her broader goals. But when we understand where these actions came from, when we trace them back to the Shaman Village and the jars of Bonnie Village, we see something else. We see a survivor who learned that mercy is weakness, that power is the only protection against victimhood, that you must strike first and strike completely, or you will be the one destroyed. The shamans were gentle, and they were slaughtered. Marika became ruthless, and she conquered the world. Can we blame her for the lesson she learned? Can we fault her for applying that lesson perhaps too well, for becoming the very thing that destroyed her people? A force that saw others as resources, as tools, as obstacles to be removed rather than people to be valued. She became powerful enough that no one could hurt her again. But in doing so, she became someone capable of hurting everyone else. And yet, we see hints of something more in Marika. The physics she created for Messmer, rare items of immense healing power, were described as mercy given to ease his suffering. She returned to the Shaman Village after becoming a goddess and bathed it in healing gold, knowing full well there was no one left to heal. These are not the actions of someone completely without feeling. These are the actions of someone who still grieves, who still remembers what it was like to be powerless, who wishes she could undo what was done, but knows she cannot. Perhaps the most significant thing about Marika is her eventual rebellion. After centuries or millennia of serving as the Greater Will's vessel, after building an entire world order around the Elden Ring, after claiming eternal power and divine authority, she chose to destroy it all. The shattering of the Elden Ring was not an accident or an impulse. It was a choice, perhaps the only truly free choice Marika ever made. She had learned that being a vessel for divine power was just another form of imprisonment, that godhood was not freedom, but the ultimate slavery. In shattering the ring, Marika destroyed her own power base. She ensured she would be punished, imprisoned, shattered herself. But she also created the conditions for change, for someone else to potentially break the cycles she could not. By calling back the Tarnished, by creating the chaos of the Shattering, by fragmenting the great runes among demigods who would war over them, she opened the door for alternatives to the Golden Order. She made it possible for someone, Ranni, or a Tarnished champion, or even the Lord of Frenzied Flame, to reject the Greater Will's authority entirely. This does not excuse her cruelties. Nothing can excuse the horrors inflicted on the Hornsent, regardless of what they did to the shamans. Nothing can justify abandoning Messmer to endless war or imprisoning her omen sons in sewers. The cycle of revenge and trauma may explain these actions, but explanation is not justification. Marika caused immense suffering, and that suffering cannot be erased by understanding her pain. But perhaps we can see her as something more than a simple antagonist. She is a warning about what happens when power is pursued as a shield against vulnerability. She is a tragedy about how systems meant to protect can become systems of oppression. She is a question about whether revolution can ever truly succeed when the revolutionary becomes the tyrant. And she is a mother, a wife, a survivor, a prisoner, a goddess, a weapon, a victim, and an executioner all at once. The Lands Between is the world Marika built from the ashes of the Shaman Village. It is glorious and terrible, beautiful and broken, exactly like its creator. And whether we mend her golden order, transform it into something new, or burn it all down and start from nothing, we are still operating within the framework of choices she made. Even in her imprisonment, even shattered and silent, Marika the Eternal remains the most influential force in the world of Elden Ring. Her story is the foundation upon which everything else is built. We have traced the complete history of Queen Marika the Eternal, from her origins as a shaman in a flower-filled village to her imprisonment as a shattered goddess within the Erd Tree. We have seen her suffer, survive, conquer, create, and ultimately rebel against the very system she built. Her story is the secret history of the lands between, the hidden foundation beneath everything we see in the game. Understanding Marika changes how we view the world of Elden Ring. Every church dedicated to her, every stake bearing her name, every echo of her voice lingering at sites of grace. These are not just environmental details, but pieces of a vast, tragic narrative. The demigods warring over the great runes are acting out the consequences of their mother's choices. The tarnished returning from death are fulfilling a plan she set in motion generations ago. Even the Erd Tree itself, that massive golden symbol of divine authority, is part of a story about a woman who became a goddess and found that godhood was just another form of slavery. Marika's tale is one of cycles, the cycle of violence that turns victims into perpetrators, the cycle of revenge that perpetuates suffering across generations, the cycle of divine succession that the greater will uses to maintain control over the lands between. By shattering the Elden Ring, Marika attempted to break these cycles, though whether she succeeded depends entirely on which ending the tarnished ultimately chooses. Her final act was one of defiance, and its consequences ripple through every possible future of the world. As you drift off to sleep, let this story settle in your thoughts. Queen Marika the Eternal, shaman, goddess, mother, prisoner. A being of immense power who discovered that power alone could never heal the wounds of her past. A ruler who shaped the world but could not shape her own fate. The Eternal made temporary, the divine made human, the goddess made mortal through her own desperate choice. Her story is the heart of Elden Ring, the truth beneath the golden surface of the age of the Erd Tree. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the lore of Queen Marika, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are many more stories to tell about the lands between, many more secrets hidden in item descriptions and whispered in the echoes of ancient sites. The world From Software and George R.R. Martin created is vast and complex, and we have only begun to unravel its mysteries. Until next time, rest well, Tarnished. May you find peace in these stories of a broken world and the broken goddess who shaped it.